Okay, so we are live. Sorry for the short delay. And I see people pouring in now, so that's good. This is now I think the fourth installment of our Lebanon policy conference. I'm very pleased to have a wonderful panel to talk about the financial crisis primarily, and what actions can be done and what interactions are happening right now with the government. My name is Jacques Tomei. I'm active member of LIFE since the beginning, and I'm on the advocate pillar, which is for the first time in LIFE's 12 years, a new pillar that was designed this year to extend our thought leadership on financial and economic issues in Lebanon from a diaspora impartial angle, and lean in on policy influence, which we now do with our partners at the Middle East Institute. With the new Lebanon program we launched with them, and we're very delighted with the new director, Chris Abi Nassif, and Paul Salem for supporting that. And the other thing we do at Advocate at LIFE is student and civil society engagement, and doing that directly on the ground in Lebanon. That is a little bit on Advocate. So let me get started on the panel. We have Saroj Kumar from the World Bank in Beirut. We have Tanos Arvanatis from the IMF. Alea Mubayed from Jefferies, Managing Director of Economics, and Dr. Nasser Saidi, who I guess would have a long introduction, but is one of our most respected economic thought leaders on Lebanon. Just going to jump right into it with Saroj. So Saroj, I mean, we want to get obviously your thoughts on the World Bank program, which has been stalled for many months, thoughts on subsidies, cash transfers, things that you're working on in a very granular way with your large and resourceful team at the World Bank. What do you think your priorities should be? How are the interactions with the government going? I'm just going to put all the questions out there, and I'm sure it's a multivariable problem that you're facing, and how is that going?
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much, Jacques, the LIFE team and the Middle East Institute for inviting the World Bank to be part of it. Our focus in Lebanon at this time is on fair and equitable vaccination of all living in Lebanon, the Lebanese and the non-Lebanese, because vaccine is economy, vaccine is everything at this time. It's about saving lives. It's about getting the private sector back on its feet. And we have a very large World Bank supported program supporting the government together with the scientific community, the medical community here to achieve, I would say, a successful vaccination program. And I want to convey our very strong appreciation to the public institutions engaged in the vaccination program in the country. This is about our doctors, paramedical workers, Lebanese Red Cross volunteers. They are doing a fantastic job. They are in the front line, and our support is very modest with the acquisition of Pfizer vaccine, which was one of the first vaccines to have come to the country. More than 80% people vaccinated so far have been vaccinated with Pfizer, which was World Bank supported. In addition, of course, we're also supporting the rollout of the vaccination program itself together with the other partners. And we're very happy with the way the vaccination program is going. There were challenges in the beginning. Any mass vaccination on this scale in any country will have problems, and Lebanon had its own share of problems. But overall, we are very satisfied. The vaccination program itself is slow, but that is more to do with the global supply constraints in the vaccine stocks that is available or not available for most countries. I hope things will get better in the coming months. The second priority for the World Bank is to find a way of helping the extremely poor households in the country. Lebanon is experiencing perhaps one of the worst forms of poverty ever seen in the history of this country. And we have made this a singular focus in our engagement with the caretaker government, with the President of the Republic, and with the Parliament to see how the program which our board of directors have already approved can be put into implementation. It's a $246 million program. And we would like the caretaker government and the parliament to come together and ensure that the program is ready for implementation, which essentially has to be based on a very credible and transparent mechanism for identification of beneficiaries, their verification, and direct payments in US dollars to these beneficiaries. It's been many, many months since our board of directors approved this program. It's been very hard to get agreement here with all the key stakeholders to get the program started. We will continue to engage with all stakeholders, the parliament and the caretaker government, to make sure that the program moves into implementation. But I must tell you that it's been extremely challenging. I cannot understand the reason for this, because how can you not come together and get the help to the people who really need help, even after a program which has already been approved by the donor organization, in this case, the World Bank's board of directors, when everything is ready to go? Why is it so difficult? I just cannot understand. So I think through this panel and everybody who is watching this, I want to convey this, that we are ready to move now. I want all the stakeholders to understand that there is a crisis and there is an urgency to help people who cannot feed their family, cannot send their children to school. This is extremely important. I'll stop here. Back to you, Jacques.
Yeah, thanks, Saroj. And I guess for those not following, I mean, the World Bank has offered quite a lot of direct assistance in the forms of, I guess, credit cards and direct transfers for things that are heavily subsidized for the poor. Primarily, that's fuel, medicine, and food. And it's been a struggle. The parliament basically goes away, and the government goes away and says, okay, we'll take the money, but under our conditions, through us and through the dependency cycle. I'll pass it to Tanos, and we'll keep this going around. And I guess the IMF is very familiar with potentially having a lot of financial and technical resources available for Lebanon, and in your case, probably for many years now, and especially in the last two. So how are your interactions going, your preliminary discussions? Is Lebanon eligible for exceptional access? Do you think audits of the central bank feature into this, or they're just part of an accountability correction? But yeah, I mean, I guess maybe starting with the entrenchment, how is that going from an IMF point of view?
Thank you, Jacques, and thank you for the invitation to be here with you. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel together with Saroj, Ali, and Nasser. Let me come to, first of all, to everybody's recognition that Lebanon is going through an unprecedented crisis, both in terms of its size, but also its complexity. The crisis has spread throughout the economy, and it's not only an economic and financial crisis, it's a social and humanitarian crisis, as Saroj just said. So, the numbers are still staggering about the cost that this crisis has imposed on the Lebanese people. And the cost is just getting bigger the longer that it takes for actually to resolve this crisis, to come with a comprehensive strategy of actually addressing the root causes and finding a way forward. Now, so from the beginning, our discussion with the government and all the counterparties that we have in the country has focused on what needs to be done. And let me spend a bit of time on this. So, what are really the priorities? And from the beginning, I think that's we and also many, including in this panel, have identified. It's really you need to focus your efforts into formulating a strategy to repair the public sector, the central bank, the financial system, and in doing so, rebuild the economy on a more sound foundation. Let me specific and give you that the strategy that needs to really be focused on 4 core areas. First, you need a credible fiscal strategy to be based on an effective debt restructuring and fiscal reforms. The government needs to decide its debt strategy going forward to bring debt to sustainable levels that are affordable and levels that can be financed and serviced over time. But at the same time, the government also needs to implement fiscal reforms. But the country is coming out of this crisis, or it's going through this crisis, with significant fiscal problems. On the revenue side, the revenues have collapsed, particularly because reflecting the contraction of the economy. And the spending needs are very large. Spending needs, not least because the country would need to expand its social protection, but also it would need to rebuild infrastructure that has been destroyed to a large part over recent years. So I think that's how do you do that? So the country will need to set a new, fair, and equitable fiscal system, a tax system, and at the same time it will need to rationalize its spending, particularly on the subsidies to SOEs. And in doing so, the country would need to put in place a fiscal framework that it is more transparent, more predictable, and something that Lebanon did not have in the past. Now, on the second area of focus, it needs to be a comprehensive strategy to repair the financial system. And this affects both the central bank and the commercial banks. On the central bank side, what is needed is a clear assessment of its balance sheet and its income position, and a credible recapitalization plan to make sure that the central bank has the credibility and the ability to perform its function. Now, the commercial banks are going to be hit because of this crisis through many channels. With the contraction economy, we have seen the non-performing loans increasing to very high levels. But at the same time, the decisions that the government would take, both in terms of the public debt, but also on how to recapitalize the central bank, would have big implications for commercial banks. And therefore, a strategy is needed of how the financial system, how the banking system is going to be repaired. Now, bank by bank diagnostic analysis will need to be conducted. Banks would need to be decided if they are viable or not. Viable banks will need to be recapitalized, and unviable banks eventually will need to be dissolved. Now, moving to the third area, the country would need a credible monetary and exchange rate system. The exchange rate, the multiplicity of exchange rate that we see now, they would need to be unified. And eventually monetary policy will need to take control over the system. And the exchange rate will need to be competitive in order for the country to be able to move forward and regain its external viability. Now, in the interim, there would be a need for formal capital controls to support the adjustment, and until the confidence comes back, at which point the capital controls would gradually be able to be removed. And lastly, the fourth area is that the performance of the economy would need to significantly improve, and it needs to facilitate the development of modern dynamic private sector. Now, on the first part, there is a clear need to strengthen the performance of the state-owned enterprises. Many of them are heavily subsidized and loss-making, and it has been a significant drain on the budget and the economy for the last several years. But at the same time, actions will need to be taken in order to create a more favorable business environment where the Lebanese entrepreneurship can really create jobs and growth, which eventually the economy needs. Now, this strategy that we have discussed from the beginning with the government, which relies on reforms for the public and the financial system, with some debt relief that is necessary for Lebanon to regain its viability, and it will need to be supported by external financial support by international institutions, but also from bilateral donors, particularly essential in the beginning, in the early stages of the transition. Now, let me make 2 points beyond the strategy. Formulating a strategy is critical, but it's not sufficient. Many of us have proposed plans, and there are good proposals out there in order to what needs to be done. But the implementation is what is lacking, and the implementation will be critical. Therefore, it's very, very important for the government to garner the necessary support to actually implement a credible strategy. Now, the second thing is time is of essence. The longer that it takes for this strategy to be formulated and implemented, the higher the cost. At this time, there are no easy solutions, and something that we need to realize. There is no magic bullet anymore for Lebanon. The crisis is so deep, and actually the solution is not going to be easy. And the piecemeal solutions will just delay the problem. So I think that's what we have been discussing with the government, a comprehensive strategy based on many of the ideas that have been proposed in order to be formulated, and then to help with the implementation. Now, from our side, from the fund side, we're prepared to work with anyone. We have worked extremely well with the World Bank and the other institutions, and with bilateral donors in order to be able to formulate this and implement such a strategy. Let me stop here and back to you.
Well, thank you. And I should note for people on Zoom, it won't apply to if you're on YouTube or on the phone, but you can go through the Q&A button at the bottom if you're on your computer, and ask questions. We're going to take some questions because we're leaving the opening remarks to only at the first third. So I guess in short, I think what the IMF and Tanos are saying is you basically need to live within your means. You need a reliable banking and financing system. There's a currency that people have to rely on, and there needs to be an economic model that isn't dependent on remittances and foreign aid for refugees and things like that. And I guess that sounds obvious, and I'll pass it to Nasser. I mean, Dr. Saidi, where are we heading? Everyone thinks Lebanon is sort of a few months away from death, and whether that's 2 months, 24 months, 36 months, and I mean financial death, meaning no banking system at all from whatever's little left. Where are the reserves of the central bank? Can the gold be relied on? I mean, where are we going? How can the country muddle along for another year like this? Tell us your thoughts.
Well, thank you first for organizing this, and of course, all the organizations that went into it, Middle East Institute, LIFE, the ATFL. So thank you for putting in the effort and trying to get this message across. And thank you. I'd like to thank both the bank and the IMF for coming in. What both representatives have said is that they're willing to support Lebanon, and they stand ready. And this is a message, unfortunately, that the caretaker government and the government before them, the Hariri government, didn't want to listen to. So where are we heading? We already have a collapse of the economy. The four major sectors of the economy, banking, financial, trade and tourism, health, and education, the four pillars of Lebanon's economy, are being gradually destroyed. We're looking at mass migration, which is currently happening. And the plan that had been prepared by the caretaker, the Diab government, got rejected by the banking and financial sector and by the central bank. The net result of that was a deliberate policy of what I call immiseration, misery of Lebanon. That is the choice of internal deflation and making the Lebanese poor instead of seeking adjustment and reform. So where are we heading now? I think we're heading towards a situation where you're increasing the inflation rate because the central bank is financing government. So you're going towards hyperinflation, even higher than what we've perceived, what we've had. You're going towards a growing lirification of deposits. That is an imposition of a financial tax, of an inflation tax, both on income and wealth, with a gradual conversion of most deposits into Lebanese pounds. So the attempt will be forthcoming, I think, in the coming weeks of a bail-in of the depositors, along with some semblance of a Capital Controls Act. You'll get an accelerated humanitarian disaster because the central bank had been subsidizing subsidies. But of course, as we well know, the subsidies, only 20% of those subsidies were actually going to the poor and needy. 80% of those subsidies actually went to smuggling, particularly to Syria, and to enrich traders and wholesalers and anybody else who could get access to foreign exchange at a favorable rate. So in answer to Saroja's question, the reason why you don't have an agreement from government and the parliament is that there are many beneficiaries of the current subsidy system. The solution is straightforward. It should be a cash-based, targeted system directly to the poor and needy, the way a number of countries have done it and the World Bank knows how to do it. So if we don't have any solution, if we don't move towards reform, and it's difficult to see how we're going to move towards reform without the government, you're going to continue on this path of collapse. I've called it a deliberate policy because I think the various parties in power right now don't want to seek a solution. Had they wanted to seek a solution, they would have agreed with the plan that was prepared back in February, March of last year, and which we had discussed with the IMF. I fully agree with Thanos on the various points that were made. You've got three interconnected balance sheets, that of the government, the banks, and the BDL. And therefore, the situation is much more complex than otherwise. If you want to proceed with the public debt restructuring, which is necessary and including debt relief, then you're going to have to restructure the banking sector. The banking sector has lost all its equity and will need to be recapitalized. So you're talking about 25 billion there just for the banking sector. You're going to need infrastructure and its financing, and you're going to have to support the economy as it goes through a transition if you have the reforms which are required. That, I think, will cost another 30 billion. And finally, you're going to need balance of payments support because you've got the two gaps, the fiscal gap and the external gap, the balance of payments gap. So in total, what we're really talking about is something in the range of $60 to $65 billion, which Lebanon needs. That can only come if you have an international consensus and if there are internal reforms and conditionality that goes with it. And the final thing, I think, which is critical, is that we need to recognize that the reason why we got here is because of corruption, because of nepotism and cronyism and the like. And therefore, I would add to what was previously said, that we're going to need a stolen asset recovery program, and we're going to need the help of the UN, the World Bank, and the IMF on that. And we're going to need sanctions on the politicians and policymakers, because the only language they seem to understand is sanctions, personal sanctions. So you freeze their assets, you freeze their deposits, and you have to put in place a special prosecutor for pursuing them in Lebanon, and not one which is beholden to the politicians. I can go on, but just on the state-owned enterprises, which was mentioned, we need reforms of the state-owned enterprises. That means, to my mind, putting them into a national wealth fund, reforming them, and improving their governance. And finally, I think when you're thinking of restructuring the central bank and recapitalizing it, that should not happen without fundamental reform of the governance of the central bank, a change of monetary policy moving towards inflation targeting with flexible exchange rates. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saidi. There's a lot to chew on there, and I'm sure a lot of people would agree. And I think in a way you answered a couple of questions indirectly that have been answered, and we'll pass it to Aliyah. I think, Aliyah, frankly, you can react to anything that was said, as a lot was there. And in addition, you obviously speak at very high levels to European leaders. How do you think they fit into any of this, whether it's what the fund is doing, whether it's some of the more political solutions that Dr. Saidi proposed, and just, I don't want to speak for him, but I can bet he was proposing these political solutions for the financial problem. In other words, saying you cannot fix the financial system and the issues and some of the questions on the Q&A, getting around the political mess until you create a credible environment. So I guess, what are the Europeans up to? And just react to anything you've heard from the last three speakers.
Thank you, Jacques, for the question, and thank you, MEI and Life and ATFL for the invitation. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to repeat what the gentleman all said. I agree with most of it, and I will not repeat because I'm tired of repeating, actually. And I think all of us are very tired of just keeping on saying the same thing. And as we reflect on where we are heading, I think maybe we cannot just think of what are the lessons learned from this period of crisis, and we should take with us in the next phase, both on the policy front, but also on how we organize ourselves and how we work collectively in Lebanon and externally with our development partners to make the path easier and more fruitful. I mean, the two, I think for me, the narrative of the crisis is one where we have moved from a long period of unsustainable policies that led to the 2019 of course, a revolution and unraveling of the banking and currency and crisis and the debt crisis. But I think what characterized this unsustainable period of economic policies, fiscal, monetary, exchange rate, is that people actually never cared about economic policies. They never asked about it, and therefore they never related to it, and that, in my view, if they didn't hold the policymakers responsible, and I think that is one important element of why we went into the crisis. They never cared about whether the state is functioning well, whether it is accumulating losses or not, and only when the crisis hit did they realize that the essential part and the essential element of what can make a recovery possible is actually state institution. And maybe this is, I'm saying this because maybe my colleagues on the panel did not stress enough the importance of that. And what I mean is not only the mode of governance, but also the capacities inside these institutions. I myself worked in various institutions in government, and I can see the deterioration in terms of the technical capacities to carry over all these elements of reform and the strategy and the framework that was laid out by both Dr. Saidi and the IMF and the World Bank. But I think the other thing we learned from the first period is that we cannot separate security from economic policies. And what we are seeing today is that a period where the economy was thriving was essential to maintain economic security. But now what we are facing actually as the crisis hit is a generalized crisis that have weakened state institutions, but also not only have eroded basically state capacity, but have also started to affect security institutions that are essential for both normal functioning of society, let alone having a normal economic activity. So as we move to this deliberate destruction period, and what we've learned from the 18 months so far hitting the crisis for me, is actually more important to take us forward. Why? Because what we've learned is few things, is that there are 5 essential elements that are necessary to move forward towards this virtual cycle that the IMF colleague has talked about, or putting in place the policies. Not only do we require a credible policy package, as he said, but more importantly is that we need the right leadership and that has enough credibility that they are not pursuing their private interests, but rather working for the collective interest. And this is important because unless you have this, there will be a lot of difficulty to get the buy-in. And that's my second element of what we need to have, is to get broad-based ownership of any strategy of reform. We can write all the strategies possible, but unless we get the Lebanese to squarely find a common ground on the strategy, it will be, in my view, very difficult to get it. And that is linked not only to the policy package, which in my view should have at its core element restoring institutions for accountability, social justice for an equitable distribution of the losses, but also more importantly, a new vision for an economic model that can guarantee prosperity for the Lebanese citizens. So unless we have this policy package that embraces this value-based propositions, in my view, in a society that is reeling under poverty, as we heard from Saroj, and further pauperization and loss of both human and physical and financial capital. I think the third element that we've learned we cannot go without is institutions, as I mentioned. And I think here the role institutions, why? Because as Thanos said, I mean, in his last two comments, in order to implement an IMF program, you need institutions that are able to work together, not to fight each other, but also institutions who can gain the credibility of external and internal stakeholders. And therefore, all the work to strengthen institutions, both in the economic field, but also more broadly to deliver on the reforms that we've talked about, business environment, procurement reform, judicial independence, etc., is at the core of what could define where we are heading at. And finally, and I agree with Dr. Saidi, the fifth element is the external support, and all the above elements that I've talked about will determine to a large extent not only the extent to which the international community, including the IMF and the World Bank, will come to support Lebanon, but more importantly, the type of interventions that are necessary, because what they need is, as I mentioned, they need a credible policy package, a leadership that is able to move forward and take the country forward, institutions capable of implementing reform, and broad-based ownership of the strategies that we have been talking about for the last few years. Thank you.
Thanks, Aliyah. I think there's a few relevant questions to what was just said. And maybe we'll pass it back to Thanos and Saroj real quick. There's a couple questions, I think, specifically around the IMF. Given your past experiences on these crises, there's a lot of political solutions that have been proposed by Aliyah and Nasser, and yeah, I think they're very entangled. But have you seen a financial crisis like this one around the world? Obviously, they're all different. And what would be the very first thing the IMF could do in implementing a rescue package or reform? Or is it just you have to sort of do everything at the same time, or is there one initial win? And then there was another question that suggested that, Dr. Saidi's calculations is $65 billion of external support. Can you clarify the initial IMF loan of $5 billion? I don't think is meant to solve all the problems. What are your goals with that initial sort of indicated $5 billion as well? So a multi-part question. And then after Thanos, I think if Saroj and Dr. Saidi, you just want to reply to him and pick up on these points with your own views, go on.
Thank you, Zach. A question with many elements. So let me try to take some of them, and then perhaps we can come back if it's a need. Clearly, what you cannot address a crisis with partial measures, and you cannot address it with piecemeal measures. And that's why from the beginning we stress that what is needed is really having the whole comprehensive strategy, at least agreed. And this is one of the major problems that we faced in the beginning, and I think that's something that also Nasser and Aliyah alluded to, that without internal agreement, without consensus of what needs to be done, it's very difficult to say what is the first measure that the authorities need to do. Because if you don't have an agreement about what else is going to come, so then there's no agreement on the package, that's not going to work. So I think that at this moment, what we're really looking is to have the authorities formulate a clear vision for Lebanon's future, a clear strategy that we take there, that it's credible and that it is implementable. I think this is where we focused all of our efforts. Now, on the financing needs, there is no doubt that Lebanon's financing needs are huge. They are much larger than we have seen in many previous crises, particularly because the crisis is so complex and it has affected so many sectors. I think what one needs to think is that within these very large financing needs, part of the financing needs could be met through debt relief. A part would be met through own adjustment that the authorities will need to do. And then there would be a part that would be covered by external financing, which needs to be temporary right? So this external financing will need to facilitate the adjustment. It will need to support the reforms. But eventually what Lebanon needs really the private sector to come in and support the development of new, dynamic, modern private sector that really where the growth and jobs are needed. Lebanese really need jobs and growth at this moment. The official sector can provide some temporary financing to facilitate all of this adjustment and reforms, but eventually confidence need to be restored, the Lebanese and the foreign investors who need to play their role. So how this is going to be distributed has not been decided. And frankly, we have not discussed with the authorities any kind of figures of how much the IMF should contribute or how much any other institutions contribute. This is a discussion that will come much later once the strategy has been agreed. And unfortunately, despite all the time that has elapsed, so we haven't really been at that point yet. So let me stop here and can come back to any other issues.
Saroj and Dr. Saidi, do you want to comment on that? And anything else? I mean, there's a question I'll throw in if you can work it into your answer. If things remain as they are with no reform, no government, no external funding, I mean, I guess what's the flip side of the do nothing coin? I think you've asked that, you've answered that as well, but that was another question thrown in there. And who are the winners in that scenario as well?
Does Saroj want to go first?
Yeah, why don't you go, Saroj? You started, so.
Thank you very much. So I want to make 4 points. First of all, the World Bank's fall 2020 economic monitor categorized Lebanon's situation as a case of deliberate depression, which is very much in line with what Dr. Saidi said. What we are experiencing today is deliberate by everyone who's responsible for reform, for decisions that need to be taken to help people of this country. So that seems to be quite deliberate. And there seems to be a consensus among everyone on this point. We are soon going to be coming up with our next economic report, which is for the spring 2021, to be released next week, which essentially provides evidence that Lebanon is sinking very, very rapidly. And it will put Lebanon among the very few countries in the world in terms of the severity of the crisis, not just the economic and financial crisis, but also the social crisis. And of course, it'll provide all the data and the analysis. It just tells us basically that the situation is extremely grim. And you have a very large number of people in the country who do not have access to 2 meals in a day. They cannot afford to keep their children in school. And they are forced to look for alternatives, including leaving this country, the point Dr. Saidi mentioned before. I'm also very concerned about losing a generation of Lebanese kids. If they're not studying in your schools, if your schools are not providing good education, what's going to happen to these kids? A country which was so well known globally for its very high quality human capital globally is struggling to get good quality education in their schools now. And I see this happening across the country. Alia made a very important point about the institutions in the country. Building institution takes generation, takes decades. And with the degradation in institutions that are happening in the country that we are experiencing, most of this is irreversible. It is going to be so difficult to rebuild these institutions because you've lost your good people. It'll be very hard to rebuild them. You may have a fantastic plan. You may have very good set of financing coming from all of us on this call and outside. If you don't have institutions, if you don't have people, I'm sorry. It is not going to help. And therefore, the question is, what can we do now? And I want to come back and I want to make 4 points, which I think is important. One, it is very important for us to get vaccination right. And this is something which we've been saying from the very early days. And I still believe that despite all the challenges we have, Lebanon has done it right to a very good extent. Because you have good public hospitals, you have good scientific community, you have good medical doctors, those who are here dedicated, committed, they're trying to make it work. And I think that needs to continue. The second is to get a comprehensive social safety net in place immediately so that you are able to provide protection to people who are really in extreme poverty and they have some resources to be able to look after their families, send their kids to the school. That is extremely important. The third is education. We cannot afford to lose sight of the fact that just because there is a caretaker government and there's a political process ongoing forever to find a consensus to form a government, the education can wait. I'm sorry, education cannot wait. The education of Lebanese kids cannot wait. This has to be every political party's agenda, and they would need to agree to continue pushing the education agenda forward. Because if the kids lose a couple of years because of what the state of the country is, I'm sorry, you're losing a generation there. So education got to be a priority, and it is possible to make this happen. That education will not wait, and we will continue to work together and provide the support. Last is giving hope to young people. There are ways of creating opportunities so that the young people can find some opportunities to get some engagement, even if it is short-term employment. I think these things need to become as a package, and we have to continue finding a way of helping people so that people have some livelihoods, some income to be able to look after their family. The last thing I want to mention is about institutions in the country. Take the case of central inspection in Lebanon. Our assessment is that here is an institution against all odds is trying to do right thing. It is trying to ensure more transparency in terms of data, access, people have information on several things. And with little resources, a public institution can give some hope to people and bring on some accountability in the system. So we have to look for these islands of opportunities where we can continue to provide the support and then see how more public institutions can continue to play their role in a very difficult political environment. I'll stop here.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're describing some of the more qualitative elements that are necessary for long-term investment, obviously, that you can do all the right things in the next 3 to 5 years and it won't be worth much without those seeds. So Dr. Saidi, I mean, I guess you can respond to either of the last two or anything you like. We're obviously getting into some of the heavier stuff now. So what are your thoughts?
Well, let's agree where we're heading and what could be done. To begin with, I mean, I describe it that we're heading towards Lebanon becoming Venezuela, yeah, a Venezuelan scenario. And I take very much on board what Siraj was just saying, that we're looking at humanitarian collapse. You need to put in a social safety net, but already for the World Bank loan that has already been approved, the political class has refused to accept it. And it's been going on for over 3 months and people are dying. So what we're talking about is a political class that does not care about its own citizens. The French President Macron came and pointed the finger at them and said, you are irresponsible, you are in effect criminal. And that's exactly what we are. So what we're facing is a criminal political class. And we all know, I mean, I think around this panel, we all know what is required. Yes, you want a complete comprehensive package, because if you don't have a complete comprehensive package, you're not going to be able to restore confidence. You're not going to be able to give hope, and you're not going to get the private sector going again. And I fully agree. The bottom line is the private sector has got to be able to create the jobs. But if the private sector is going to be creating the jobs and doing the investment, then it needs to have a clear macroeconomic picture. It needs to have monetary stability. It needs to have the fiscal reforms, all of that put together. So this issue of clear vision is very necessary. But we don't have that until we have a government in place that is credible, that is non-partisan, but also has wide powers. And we don't have a lot of time. Let me point to the fact that we're looking at just about 1 year from now having elections. And many of us who are activists are hoping that we'll be able to change the configuration of parliament. But if we're going to have a government in place, it means whatever government has basically just little less than 12 months to get a whole list of things that we want to happen. You need to give a government extraordinary powers. And I'm not sure whether the current configuration of political fragmentation is going to enable that. Any government that's going to come in right now, I call a harakiri government. They're going to have to be people who say to themselves, I'm going to have to take very tough decisions, and at the end of the day, I'm not going to have any political future. That is what it should be about. The main question at the moment, I think, is dealing with the banking and financial sector, and how do you share the burden between them? When I mentioned the numbers, I mentioned 25 billion for the banking sector. In my view, that should be by the shareholders and the main beneficiaries of central banking largesse. So the 25 billion should be financed internally, in my view, mainly from shareholders, mainly from the banks selling assets that they have abroad, subsidiaries, branches, and all the rest, retrenching, selling assets that they have at home, in particular real estate, and all the rest. I think my estimate is that if you force the banks to do that, you can bring in some 20 billion, maybe a bit less. The rest will have to be partly a bail-in by depositors. So that'll be some fair burden sharing. So you're going to have that. But of course, the shareholders of the banks are going to tell you, we're not going to do that until you tell us what the shape of public debt restructuring is going to take place. So again, we're back to square one in terms of having to offer a complete package, a public debt restructuring, a haircut on the debt, debt relief, recapitalization of the banks, recapitalization of the central bank. So that will have to be comprehensive. I'll throw out an idea. Part of the recapitalization of the central bank, you're not going to be able to get that from government unless you get somebody who's willing to provide us with external aid. So maybe one way is to turn the central bank into something like the Swiss National Bank. The Swiss National Bank is 80% owned by government and public entities and 20% owned by banks and individuals. It's listed on the stock exchange. So one thing we could do is get it to be 75, 80% government owned and public entities owned, and 25% owned by the banks. So you get a debt conversion by the banks. I'll throw that out as being a little bit revolutionary, but certainly feasible. Why not? We should think of moving ahead on that. But I guess the main issue which is going to arise is how do we act quickly over the next year? Because that is the perspective. And I guess my main worry when I look at the political landscape at the moment is that they don't seem to be moving. All they're caring about right now is probably getting themselves re-elected. Each party will take care of their own partisans and their own party members and all the rest. That's certainly happening on the ground. And my fear is, as Saroj was saying, is that the poor and needy will get poorer and needier. Already we're talking about 55% under the poverty line, 25% under the food poverty line. And my fear is that we might head towards famine in Lebanon, something we have not had since 1914, 1918. That's my fear. And the other thing is what Alia was mentioning. We're going towards physical security. Already, if you think about the army and the internal security forces, their salaries have come down to around maybe on average, maybe $75 a month. That's about the minimum wage in Bangladesh, okay? And I've heard numbers touted of some 10,000 to 12,000 members of the army, soldiers and others that have melted away, understandably. If that continues, then what you're talking about is generalized insecurity in Lebanon. I think that is the big fear for the international community. There are some attempts now to provide aid directly to the army, but that's really a drop in the ocean. And increasingly, of course, as inflation continues, there will be calls for inflation adjustment of wages, right? In particular in the public sector. Lebanon, of course, cannot afford that. But of course, the politicians will want to push in that direction, in which case you're going to go into the hyperinflationary spiral, because that will get increasing printing of money by the central bank. So that seems where we seem to be heading at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think the U.S. government did this week re-up and increase its support for the LAF precisely for those security concerns and the relative salary movements of the LAF soldiers. But I agreed, it's still a drop at the end of the day, and perhaps symbolic. Although it does, most of the budget is salaries, and it does provide some stability. Aliyah, people have floated the idea of an emergency cabinet that would have extraordinary powers. Dr. Saidi has suggested it. Do you feel like the Europeans or other stakeholders you deal with would be able to support and even, I don't want to say sponsor or underwrite, but let's say support to the extent possible? Obviously, if the composition and structure was good, that's implied. Or do you think what other structure or solution can implement all these, I would say, reasonably obvious solutions we've been debating, and resources available by the bank and the fund right on here? If not an emergency cabinet, what would work, or what would be supported?
Well, thank you for your question. If I go back to the title of this session, that we're into a transformational economic crisis, I do believe that we can only get out of it if we have a transformational structure and strategy and people who are able to transform. And therefore, I think an emergency, a cabinet that fits the criteria of independence, expertise, but also an expertise not in the sense that they are expert but they don't understand politics, because everything is about political economy, particularly when we are going to talk about the distribution of the losses. But I think you need a transformational exit strategy through exceptional structure. But the problem is that this has been the demand of a part of the Lebanese, or at least those who have gone onto the streets. And this has proven so far not to work. What we are seeing, and we just heard prior to this session, Mr. Duquesne, is that we are moving from the need to have such a high caliber gouvernement de mission with exceptional powers for at least legislation, to any kind of government. And I think that is a recipe for disaster, or for the negative scenario that Dr. Saidi outlined. I think what we need to do now is really make sure, and that brings me to what the Europeans are saying. I think the Europeans, but also other donors, are providing Lebanon with a lot of tools, both to manage the transition out of the crisis better by providing, all the humanitarian assistance. But I think what is interesting also in the European case is that the new neighborhood policy that was recently approved by the European Commission focuses on sectors that are really the kind of sector that Lebanon needs in order to transform its economic model. That is moving towards a digital economy, to improve efficiency, improve transparency in public sector, but also move to sustainable kind of support to promote sustainable investments, whether in energy or in other sector. And I think also the third element is of the European strategy for all the countries around the Mediterranean, is to move towards more inclusive growth, and i.e. support jobs, but also support institutions that deliver safety net and strong social protection. I think what we need to do is not to wait until we get a new government and get into an IMF program to make use of these tools and these instruments that are available to us already today. I mean, what do we need why can't we start maybe unlock some of the funding that the World Bank has been eager and has invested a lot of time and effort to provide the advice and assistance to reform the sector. So there are the same in the civil service reform, the same in the social protection field. Again, the World Bank has had a very important contribution. We do not need to wait until we have a new government. We have to seize every moment, every opportunity that both external partners, but also Lebanese in the diaspora are providing to advance not only in the public debate, but also continue to push. And maybe the last point that I want to make is that any strategy that needs to be done, and even if it is for a stabilization policy, I think its design should take into consideration this new economic model that we want to promote. Our taxation policy should not be only about the distribution, how to make a better distribution of the losses in the financial system. It should be about what kind of economic model it should be. And I think this is what I understand from the IMF comprehensive approach to the strategy, because of the last element that was put forward. I think the Europeans and other donors are all want to support Lebanon in this direction, provided that that we use the tools that are being given to us.
So Aliyah, you actually bridged us to a couple questions that I was hoping Saroj and Nasser could answer. So there's two questions from the crowd on the private sector. And maybe Saroj, you can go first. So one question is, what advice can you give the Rima Frazier is calling herself private sector activist in terms of influence or pressuring or lobbying the needed transformation? And then there's another question about which sectors and success stories can be further promoted and produce growth, such as health tourism and tech entrepreneurship. But I guess let's start with the first one. I mean, what advice can you give on where to push, where to influence, and get the sort of private sector transformation that the IMF and Tanos has said is a necessary ingredient anyway for any sort of restructuring?
Thank you very much. I think the private sector in Lebanon has played a very important role, and they constitute pretty much the most productive part of the Lebanese economy historically. Jacques, as you mentioned, there are tremendous opportunities for the private sector in Lebanon to be able to do more business. And I give the example of COVID-19 response-related equipments, vaccines. And this is an area of tremendous potential, because as we know, the countries are going into one after another wave of COVID-19. They need PPEs, they need various equipments. You have vaccines coming up, and more vaccines would be needed in the Arab region and beyond. And I know that there are Lebanese companies, pharmaceutical companies and other companies are looking to do business in this sector. There are going to be these opportunities. Of course, agriculture is another area where Lebanon has tremendous potential, tourism, medical tourism. And we had McKinsey report before. There are several World Bank reports which have identified these sectors where Lebanon has a comparative advantage. And I think private sector as a collective would need to engage with the broader political class on certain no regret reforms that needs to be undertaken now, which can basically unlock the business potential for the businesses with the parliament, with the political system. And I think that needs to be there has to be that dialogue and engagement to move things forward. The other point I wanted to mention is that Lebanon has historically been very good at doing business with other countries in the region, but also with Europe and other parts of the world, reaching out to new markets. And I think that is also an area post-COVID-19. You're looking at a very different world in terms of the economic opportunities, a new normal, as we all call it. And I think Lebanon is very well prepared to really benefit from that kind of early thinking and organizing its business processes, its workforce, and its value chain, and the markets where they would like to engage. So there are going to be these tremendous opportunities. And I know many businesses in Lebanon who are already working on this. One thing great about this beautiful country is that despite the challenges and the adversity that we're all experiencing here in the country, there are signs of brilliance and innovation and creativity that people continue to work towards. I think all that the political class, the government, caretaker government, and the parliament could do is to create that enabling condition for the businesses to be much more effective. So that is what I would advise. I'll stop here.
Dr. Saidi, do you want to follow up on that?
Sure. Yeah. Let me just state that whatever new Lebanon we will want to create through some sort of transformation will still require basic infrastructure. So let's agree that. So I'll put that in the background in terms of electricity, power, road, transport, and all the rest. So what we need to think of is the new sectors. So let me throw out a number of these. Alia mentioned the digital economy, and absolutely, I think we have a highly educated population, and certainly if I look at the IT sector and related, we certainly have the resources, the human capital resources, as well as the financial resources, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So digitalizing the whole economy is an enormous potential, including, of course, digitalizing government, right? Not just e-government, but digital government, mobile government, because that would be a most effective tool for combating corruption, bribery, and waste, and the rest, including for e-procurement and the right. So digitalization, I think, is a major one. Second one, I think, is new energy. So whenever we're thinking about the electricity sector, we don't want to go back and rebuild plants the way they used to. We can think of solar and hydro as well as wind power in Lebanon as an alternative source. And that can be done entirely by the private sector, as well rebuilding the fossil fuel-based power sector. So new energy, I think, should be very much on the agenda. The third, I think, is agri-tech. We have a small territory, but we have potentially the opportunity to introduce new technology. We have, for example, in Lebanon, launched something called agri-tech through Beritech, which many people know. It's been actively helping farmers and others introduce new technology into agriculture, into traditional agriculture. What we need to do, however, is to go into high-value added agriculture, where you use the new technology, and also make sure that we have the markets, and in particular the markets in the Gulf countries. That's essential. The other one, I think, is culture. It's not just cultural tourism, that's historical and cultural tourism, but selling our own culture internationally. Our food, our everything that is Lebanon, going from fashion to jewelry to everything that means living a Lebanese style. I think that has enormous potential. And if you bring all that together, I want to mention financing. One of the reasons why we got into a deep crisis is that we didn't have the proper financial markets working. What I mean by that is that if you look at the debt of the government, only part of it was sold on international markets, right? That was the Euro bonds and the like. The treasury bills and bonds of Lebanon did not have a ready market. The central bank prevented that. They did not want to see interest rates rise and the prices drop. As a result of that, you prevented market adjustment, and therefore the burden now is much larger. But what we need to do moving forward is to activate the financial markets to allow the funds, particularly from expatriates, to flow through the financial markets into the private sector. So I think that should be a major part of of reform. And the last thing, and I think, and this is where I want to be very hopeful, is the enormous power of the Lebanese diaspora. You're organizing this, you're part of the expatriate community, and this enormous network of Lebanese in all sectors around the world. I think the power of that exo-economy is tremendous. So what all that exo-economy needs is simply a stabilization of the economy, basic infrastructure to be provided, the hope that good governance will get introduced, rebuilding institutions. And I think if we have that in place, I have no doubt that with the power of the diaspora, we can help revive Lebanon, along with all the new sectors which are extremely promising. Thank you.
Thanks, Doctor. We're hitting the end here. So maybe Tanos and Aliyah, can you give us very brief answers in the next few minutes? So maybe if two parts, maybe just make a comment on the diaspora and how it can best be leveraged or used. I think everybody knows it's a large, disproportionately sizable and influential diaspora and skilled that can help the country and often tries to. And then there's a specific question about, and Tanos, I'm curious how the fund has dealt with this, your experience, but there are good seeds in Lebanon's public institutions. Obviously, they have no authority of any kind, but they have the ability to interact and construct plans and you know, steer the needle a little bit. What strategies can be prevented to have them become part of the diaspora and flee? And I guess that's Tanos and Aliyah, if you can just take quick shots at both those things. I know they're difficult topics, but we're hitting the end here.